Greetings. I hope you are having a wonderful day. And today, before I begin talking about the ancient Greeks and especially the ancient Athenians and moving from the Ionians to the Sophists, I gave you basically a little outline. It's not real important for exam purposes, although in this mini lecture I will point out a couple of things that might make for good exam questions. But I wanted to kind of give you an overview of the Greek city-state system because Greek society was very different than American society. A couple of things that I find interesting that are not on your outline is that the population of the ancient Greek world, for example, if we were to go back in time to the year 400 BC, ancient Greece had a population of about 13 million people. Today, in 2020, Greece actually has less than 11 million people. So the population of Greece today is more than 2 million less than it was 2,400 years ago. Greece today has the 87th largest population in the world, but their population is declining and pretty significantly because the total fertility rate, and total fertility rate is the average number of children for women of childbearing age, is only about 1.35, which means that the average woman in Greece has less than two children. 2.06 is considered replacement. So you can see that unless Greece begins having a lot of immigrants to the country, the population of this country is going to decline. Now, in 1900, the total fertility rate in Greece was 5.47, meaning that the average Greek woman had about five and a half children. Now, if we look at Athens, which is going to be the star when we talk about um, political philosophy in the Greek world, we're going to talk about ancient Athens. Ancient Athens, uh, the city varied. I've seen various estimates. There was a census in the year 317 BC, and the census of Athens was pegged at 493,000. I've seen figures as low as about 200,000, and this is the highest figure that I've seen. The average city state had less than 10,000 people. You should know for exam purposes that the Greek city-state system, that unlike today, the Greeks formed these city-states. Athens and Sparta would be the two most famous in the ancient world. And this city-state was called a polis. So if I ask you on the exam, a polis was what? It would be a city-state. Athens today has over 3 million people. The last time I looked was last year, 3,154,000. So even though the total population of Greece today is less than ancient Greece, the population of Athens is much, much, much higher. You may remember earlier I talked about the notion of nations versus states. And so the Greeks really were a nation. And by that, what I mean is that the Greeks did have common ties of language and religion, but wars were commonplace. The country was really not unified until very late because geography has really been a curse to the Greeks. It's been divided by mountains. Some of Greece are islands that are divided by sea. There are very narrow valleys that are surrounded by mountain ranges, which separated really the Greek states into relatively isolated communities. That does not mean that they were always at war with each other. Sometimes the ancient Greeks saw a bigger enemy than themselves. A great example of that would be how the Greek city states unified and rallied to fight the Persians. But the city state mentality, if you're following along in your notes, really was a barrier to unification. And even though it seems like they should have unified, after all, the lack of unification of the Greeks is one of the reasons why they fell prey to a society that was unified, the Roman Empire. This mentality was a barrier to unification, much like nationalism today is a barrier to world unity. So Greece did not become a unified country until the 1800s. So even though the Greeks as a nation, as a people, have been around for a long, long time, a unified Greek state did not emerge until after the United States, did not emerge until the 19th century. Uh, in Athens, which is the city we're going to concentrate our attention on, there were more slaves than citizens for centuries in Athens. However, don't look at slavery in the Greek world in the same way that slavery existed in the American South for many years. Of course, in the American South, we're talking about a system that was very economically exploitative. Slaves were bought and sold, families were separated, slaves were mistreated, were beaten, were killed in many cases. But in the Greek world, slaves were protected by the law. Slaves had freedoms such as freedom of speech and action, even though slaves were, in a sense, right, a kind of property. Certainly, you would not think of the American South, say in the 1840s or 1850s, where slaves could assert freedoms of speech, for example. Unlike the American South, where slaves generally worked for their masters and the masters were not out there working directly with their slaves, they may have had overseers or other white foremen overseeing this work. But in the Greek world, slaves generally worked with the master. The standard of living for both the slave and the master was typically not that high, so certainly very, very far from the American plantation system, which is kind of our notion of slavery in the South. No master could put a slave to death, and owners were often required to sell a slave, and often to the state. If that slave was mistreated, then the master would lose that slave to the state. And think about how alien this is to the American South. Look at that provision number 5 in your notes, that there were slaves that worked for the Athenian city-state that were bureaucrats, everything from accountants to other kinds of bureaucrats. They were policemen, they were jailers, they were construction workers, and certainly these things are obviously very, very different than what we see and read in the American South. There was a debate for quite some time in Athens about whether slavery should be permitted or not. So there were strong abolitionist sentiments in Athens, although the abolitionists were on the losing side of this debate. Slavery was something that there was not a universal agreement upon. There are some things that look familiar, especially for us in California with the ancient Greek world. There was both direct and indirect democracy in the Athenian world. I'll talk about that in a minute. In California, we have direct democracy through the initiative and through the recall processes. And obviously, we have indirect democracy in California with the election of our assemblymen and state legislators, for example. The city-state, because it was a lot smaller in Athens, it was much more personal than the 40 million people of California or the 330 million people in the U.S. In the Greek world, citizens were seen as part of the state. The state was part of them. There was very widespread participation and interest in state affairs. The idea was that citizenship is what fully defined humans. It is what made us human. The state was almost seen as a living organism. It's called the organic view of the state. This is something totally different than in the United States or in most modern democratic societies, where we believe the government is an instrument. It's artificial. We created it. For those of you who took 1201, you may remember social contract theory, that government is created by the mutual consent of the governors and governed, and people form a state to serve them in some way, to provide order or to protect their liberties or whatever it happens to be. In the ancient world, that was not true. It was the state that was superior to the individual because the state gave individuals their meaning. In the religious world, there was not separation of church and state as we have in American society today. Religiously, the state gods were the gods of individuals. The citizen did not have to separate their religious and political affairs like we see with the separation of church and state in America today. So unity and belonging were essential in the Greek world. The Greek city-state provided this essential role of citizen. Like the United States, in fact, I would argue to a far greater extent, the Greek city-state, especially ancient Athens, provided for the welfare of its citizens. Notice in number 9, in ancient Athens, there were public works, there were defense projects, there was relief for the poor, there was pensions for disabled veterans, there was business and price regulations, and the state ensured a minimum standard of living for its people. Put some stars next to this name under Pericles. One of the questions that I will ask on the exam, and I'm going to talk about Pericles later, but Pericles was the most ardent, he was the most vocal defender of democracy. He was a huge believer in the common man and in the virtue of individuals. He was a tremendous optimist, and he probably is the greatest leader of the ancient Athenian world. Under Pericles, the state underwrote a minimum of economic welfare for its citizens. So if Pericles were to look at American society today, he would be a bit appalled. The wealth and income inequality that we see in the United States, that is the greatest in the advanced democratic world, I think would be appalling to Pericles. He might sound a bit like Mr. Yang, who you may remember ran for president with this minimum income idea. I think Pericles would kind of be somewhat like him in terms of we need to ensure a minimum standard of living for our citizens. The last provision really discusses both the direct democracy, and that would be the assembly. The assembly consisted of all male citizens over age 20. So everyone could gather together, they could debate measures, and they would vote on measures. They had a session approximately once a month. As you can see, 10 sessions a year is close to once a month. There were very occasionally special sessions. They weren't called very often. The permanent governing body that governed in between sessions of the assembly was called the Council of 500. They used proportional representation. They drew lots for who would get to serve. The terms of office, notice, very different than in American society today. The term of office was limited to 1 year, and people could not serve 2 consecutive terms. So they did not have a situation like we have in the United States, where maybe a senator is serving for 35 or 40 years, or a House member serving 35 or 40 years. This is a duty that you perform. You perform it for a year, and then you're termed out, and it's another person's term. So that is a bit of the overviews of the Greek world. And in the next mini lecture, we will move to the Sophists and Athenian society. Have a great day. Take care of yourself. Email me if you have any questions or concerns.